Even though I know nothing about it, I can still say confidently that history is a vital component to political science because you can't understand what's going on in the present without understanding where the present came from. So, since the phenomenon we've just begun to discuss, identity politics, roughly, though, despite the pejorative associations people have for those who use this term, and you refer to it in a less charged way for this reason with as the identity synthesis. But because this emerged from the left, and since your work is concerned, among other things, with the origin of identity politics, we should probably just start with what the left's core attitudes toward or their philosophy concerning race, sex, religion, socioeconomic class were 50 or 60 years ago before the beginnings of this movement began to stir. So, how was equality conceived of at this time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the fundamental approach of conservatism and of the right in history, especially when you go back to Europe in the 17th, 18th century and so on, was to preserve society as it was, and society as it was structured by all kinds of profound hierarchies. Right, men had rights, women did not. Aristocrats had rights, commoners did not. Certainly heterosexual had rights that homosexuals or other sexual minorities decidedly did not at the time, and so on and so forth. And the left's ambition was for centuries, not just for decades, to create a society in which those kind of distinctions would matter less, in which what your opportunities are, what your life prospects are, how you're treated would come to depend less rather than more on the particular group of which you're a part. And a core part of that argument was to say that we're not as defined by the group into which we're born as some of those conservatives would hold, that you can have meaningful understanding, cooperation, partnership, love between members of different cultural or ethnic groups, for example. That to me is the core aspiration, the core humanist, the universalist inside of the left, which has made me think of myself as a left winger since I started thinking about politics. Now, it is true that that universalist left has then sometimes been blind to or dismissive of the real discrimination that members of minority groups experience. And so you had a form of that left-wing activism which in one kind of sense is identity politics, in that it organized members of oppressed identity groups to fight against those kind of injustices. So when you think of something like the civil rights movement or the movement in India for the rights of so-called untouchables, those all took that kind of form. But they still preserve the aspiration for a society in which we would overcome those forms of discrimination, such that the society would then be less structured around those forms of identity. And what I think is really remarkable about the intellectual turn of the left in the last 50 or 60 years, which started in sort of obscure seminar rooms at universities, but then eventually took over a lot of mainstream institutions in the United States and elsewhere, is a very different embrace of identity. Not just a recognition that many people are discriminated against on the basis of their identity and that we need to redress that, but really an embrace of the idea that who you are is fundamentally determined by your identity, that you may not be able to understand somebody of a different ethnic or cultural or gender group if you don't have belong in the same group, if you don't have the same experiences. That trying to live up to the kind of universal aspirations of the civil rights movement is a profound mistake. That will never work, and therefore we actually have to embrace a society in which how we're treated by your peers or how you're treated by the state will always profoundly and fundamentally depend on the ascriptive group, on the kind of ethnic, religious, sexual group into which you were born. And that, I think, is just a radical rejection, not just of a longer leftist tradition of humanism and universalism, but also of the key tenets of the civil rights movement. And that's why, I find it to be a profound mistake, and one that's worth worrying about, even in 2023, as we also face this very serious threat from people like Trump.